How can an artist go from painting these kinds of masterpieces to painting these kinds of works a decade later? What happened to the Renaissance master Sandro Botticelli when he got older? Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippeppi, better known as Botticelli, was born in 1445, and when he was 36 years old he was summoned by the Pope to travel from his native Florence to Rome to paint some large frescoes on the walls of the newly completed Sistine Chapel. It was a very prestigious commission, and when he returned to Florence, his reputation as one of the best artists of the day was greatly enhanced. Back in Florence, he decided to paint La Primavera, and 3 years later, The Birth of Venus. Works that both have an immediate visual appeal, but are also very intriguing as they contain different layers of complexity that still keep art historians busy till today. But then, a decade later, he was painting works like this. Nowhere near the quality of the spectacular works he painted earlier. So the big question is, what happened to Botticelli during that decade? To understand Botticelli a bit better, it is good to first look at some of his works that he made in his 20s and early 30s before he became popular. When Botticelli was 16 years old, he became an apprentice to Fra Filippo Lippi, one of the leading Florentine painters at that time, and someone who was favored by the influential Medici family. You may know Lippi from works like these. Arguably, the most famous among them all is his Madonna and Child with Two Angels, painted during the time that Botticelli was his pupil. One reason why this painting is popular is that it depicts the Virgin Mary in a much more elegant way than other artists up until that time had done. Having spent several years in Lippi's workshop, it is not surprising to see the style of Lippi emulated to a great extent in Botticelli's early works. Among them are several Madonna paintings where he tried to paint the Virgin Mary in a similarly elegant and graceful way as his master did. He may not have been at the same level as Lippi yet, but he was still young and developing himself. Botticelli then started to work on more complicated compositions, like these depictions of the Adoration of the Magi. These kinds of works were highly appreciated during a time that many churches were searching for great artists who could fill their walls with frescoes containing many different people. And so, these works contributed to his status and meant that he was invited by the Pope to paint some frescoes on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. Not only was it a great thing to have a prestigious commission of the Pope on your resume, these works were also seen by many visitors to the Sistine Chapel, a great way to market himself. Back in Florence, now in his late 30s, Botticelli naturally received some more valuable commissions from the Medici family and other wealthy Florentines. Among these commissions were two complicated mythological works. First, La Primavera, around 1482, and some 3 years later, The Birth of Venus. These works ended up in some expensive villas but are nowadays in the Uffizi Museum and among the most famous artworks ever painted. I will not explain their meanings here in detail as both works deserve their separate videos. If interested, here's a link to a video discussing La Primavera in some more detail. With commissions from the Pope and the immensely wealthy and influential Medici family, and delivering on their expectations, you would expect that Botticelli was on top of the world now, with lots of money, a nice house, a large workshop, and so on. Well, that wasn't exactly true. First off, Botticelli was not very good with money management, and he still lived in the house that his father bought for the family in 1470. He was not married, lived there with his brothers and their family, and mostly worked from home, something that was quite unusual for someone as successful as him. A few years after the birth of Venus, there was a friar named Savonarola who became very influential in Florence. He preached like a prophet about biblical subjects like the rich people exploiting the poor and corruption. And he also had ideas about art. Secular art would have to be destroyed, and he also complained of the paintings in Florentine churches, and I quote, "You have made the Virgin appear dressed as a whore." Savonarola's ideas were embraced by many Florentines, including Botticelli, and so he would have to cut down on his secular mythological works, and his elegant and gracious depictions of the Virgin Mary had to be replaced by more truthful depictions of biblical stories and figures. The famous art historian Giorgio Vasari, who was born in the year 1511, a year after Botticelli died, even wrote the following about Botticelli in his book. Botticelli was a follower of Savonarola's, and this was why he gave up painting, and then fell into considerable distress, as he had no other source of income. Nonetheless, he remained an obstinate member of the sect, and abandoning his work. So finally, as an old man, he found himself so poor that if Lorenzo de' Medici and his friends had not come to his assistance, he would have almost died of hunger. Well, it did not get quite as extreme for Botticelli, but the influence of Savonarola was definitely there. His output decreased in the 1490s and his works became more sober. Not exactly the style that the majority of people today would appreciate. It did not mean that he didn't know how to paint properly anymore, because during this period he still produced some wonderful paintings in line with his more colorful and graceful style from earlier in his career. Here is, for example, the Calumny of Apelles, which definitely evokes memories of his heydays when he painted the birth of Venus. And it is a mythological story, something that Savonarola would not approve of, and so it is speculated that he just painted it for his own private use. To put it in perspective, this same year he painted the Last Communion of Saint Jerome, something that Savonarola would definitely approve of. And so instead of painting many other bright, colorful, intriguing masterpieces, the world has ended up with religious works like this Lamentation over the Dead Christ. Not to say that there's no beauty in these kinds of works, but they definitely are in stark contrast to the wildly popular works from earlier in his career. I am curious to hear your thoughts about Botticelli's art in the comment section down below. Like, what is your favorite work by Botticelli? So this is the story of Botticelli's rise and fall, at least from the perspective of an art lover. And while the works from late in his career are much less known than those earlier in his career, there are still some gorgeous works among them, as you can see here. And while the world moved into the High Renaissance with spectacular works by Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo and Raphael, Sandro Botticelli slowly faded in obscurity. He didn't embrace the use of oil paint like his colleagues. Instead, he always painted in tempera, a much more difficult medium. What remained were his panel paintings and frescoes. But for the next 4 centuries, Botticelli was an artist that remained in the margins of art history, overshadowed by his more popular colleagues. Until the beginning of the 20th century, when he was completely rediscovered and has been reinstated among the greatest artists in history. In 2021, for example, this portrait by Botticelli was sold for more than $90 million. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion about the life of Sandro Botticelli. If you want to learn more about it, I hope you have the possibility of visiting the Uffizi Museum in Florence one day. Few feelings compare to the experience of walking into the room where the birth of Venus hangs. And then you turn around and you can also admire La Primavera. Finally, if you want to support the channel, just hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more weekly art videos. thanks for watching.